I want to talk about a little bit of history and how my first history with the shellfish disease, and it actually was clams and not oysters. So in 1989, I was newly graduated from college, and I had worked on the bay most of my life, and I loved being out working on the bay. I loved the independence of it. I loved the physical work. I loved being outside, and I didn't do well with authority, so it was great to be my own boss. That's still the case today. So in 1989, I decided, one more summer working on the bay, and I heard about some guys out in Wellfleet that were growing clams. I'd never heard about aquaculture or shellfish farming, and I had this passion for shellfishing, but the reason I didn't want to make it a living was in 1986 I was digging mussels in Duxbury, and I was making all kinds of money and had no responsibility, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. I almost dropped out of college, and in October of that month there was Hurricane Bob, I believe, and it blew every mussel in Duxbury Bay up onto Duxbury Beach, where they then died and rotted. So that's kind of how the life is of a shellfisherman. That next summer I switched to digging razor clams, and but it's that uncertainty, the whim of nature, that you could be trying to figure out what you're going to be doing, the next month. And I knew that wasn't going to be my life. On top of that, in my early 20s, working hard physically was fine, but I knew when I got to be my age, I wouldn't be able to do what I was doing in my 20s. And I'm sure you find that hard to believe. Still. So anyway, in 1989, I heard about guys growing clams in Wellfleet, and as it was explained to me, these guys were driving new trucks, which is the dream of every kid who's digging shellfish, and even better, going to Florida in the winter. Sounded like a dream scenario. So, and if you think about it, like, you're out harvesting shellfish in the wild, there's one here, one there. The whole idea of the farming was that, the idea of farming is that you own that plot, so any shellfish on that plot is yours, and that you can plant them in such a way that you could go out and harvest, 20 times what you would be able to get in the wild every day. So it was really appealing. I would say that I was hooked, but I'd say more that at that point I was screwed. I had to do it. So in 1990, I met the guy who owned the hatchery. I didn't know it even existed, down in Dennis, Mass. It's called ARC. The owner's name was Dick Krause, and went down there and bought 4,000 little tiny baby clams. They look like probably about the size of a peppercorn. And he explained to me that how they do it in Wellfleet, they put them in these wire trays lined with screen to keep the crabs out, put some sand in. They grow the clams all summer long, and by August or September, they're up to the size of like a dime or a nickel. And at that point, you can put them right into the bottom. It takes about a year and a half after that, so about two plus years in total, and then they're market size, you can harvest them. So I did this, and to my surprise, they grew really well through the summer. In August, I planted the 4,000 out at like 70 per square foot, so it was a little tiny area. The next year, built on this confidence that it had worked, I scraped together every penny that I could save, which came out to about $3,600, which was a lot of money for a guy who was shellfishing to pay my bills. Used that money, I bought 150,000 clams, which was, potentially more money than I would have been if I could harvest that than had I gone out and got a job in an office. So I was pretty excited about it. Grew them through the summer. That fall, I planted them out in the bottom, and I was all excited. And probably this doesn't mean much to most of you, but October 31st, 1991. Does anybody know what happened that day? No? It's the Halloween storm. Yeah, the perfect storm. The no-name storm is what they called it. And it blew all my nets away. It blew a lot of the clams out of the bottom. And I probably should have given up then. But, being that it was a 100-year storm, I thought, well, I'm good for 100 years. So I got through the next year. In the spring, I bought 150,000 more clams and, saved up all my money, bought these clams, and grew them through the summer and planted them out. And I can't remember exactly what the date was, but early December 1992, another 100-year storm. So now I'm good for 200 years. So, but really, most of the shellfish survived. In 1993, I harvested a bunch of those first-year clams. I took that money and bought more clam seed, and that fall, I was reading through a National Fisherman, and in the back of the magazine, there was an advertisement for clam seed. There was a place in New Jersey, so I called them up, and sure enough, they were approved to sell shellfish in Massachusetts. So the approval is, in order to ship seed anywhere, we have to send it to a pathologist. They, check it to make sure that under slides, a microscope, check to make sure there's no disease, and they give you a certification to move the shellfish around. So these were all clean, they were okay to buy, so I bought 100,000 of those that fall. So now I have 250,000 that I'm gonna really, break the bank here. And so anyway, I had 150,000 ARC clams that year, 100,000 Bay Farm clams that I bought that summer. And Bay Farm is the hatchery in New Jersey or nursery that I bought them from. And 1995, I just started harvesting the ARC clams. And I noticed in the Bay Farm clams that there were little pockets of dead shells. But to give you some context, these 50,000 each row, so I had 5 rows that are 50,000. They're 15 feet wide, the nets are, and 100 feet long, so all the way from here to the door. So to see like a dozen little shells here, a dozen shells there, not the end of the world. And I just figured there were crabs underneath the nets, so I even had a pitchfork and I was stabbing in the mud trying to figure out if I could kill something that was under there. Well, the scary part was it got progressively worse. The clams that I was selling back to ARC, the hatchery. They were also a wholesaler, so you could bring your clams in and sell them to the hatchery, and it was great. They could actually hold some of that money so that you could get seed in the spring. I told the guy, Dick Krause, who owned the hatchery, about this, and they were super psyched that there was a new area where clams were growing because it was a place for them to sell seed and a place for them to buy clams back from, kind of like the Island Creek model now. So he came down, he looked at it, and he said, something's not right. He said, I've never seen clams die. So we took some of the clams out, and I knew nothing about this. I didn't even know that pathologists exist. So we sent them off to William and Mary, to the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and a couple weeks later, Dick Krause called me with the horrifying news that my clams had the first ever disease. They had never seen a clam disease, and my clams had a disease. And so, you can imagine, I didn't know anything about disease. It's 1995. I was a young kid. I'd put 5 years into this, and I'd put every penny that I could put aside into this dream of mine. And I'm told that I have a disease, that my clams have a disease. I couldn't help but ask, why did this happen to me? What does this mean? Why? I had no sense of what does it look like? What does it mean that there's a disease? And so my biggest concern actually at that point was, what if I brought in a disease from the Bay Farm clams? What if there was something in those clams and I brought it in? There were people that came from near and far to come to Duxbury to dig little necks. So people came from Bridgewater and Quincy and Duxbury, Marshfield, and this had gone on forever. What if I wiped that out? What if all of a sudden the town I grew up in, everybody, when I went to the grocery store, that's the guy. He ruined it. It was horrifying. I mean, I couldn't sleep at night. There was the part of, obviously, of now I'm gonna have to get a freaking job, but also, well, I'm gonna have to move far away. So it was really scary. QPX is the name of the disease and stands for Quahog parasite unknown. So they still don't really know enough to classify the disease. So anyway, I can remember there were 2 different things that really changed my perspective about disease. So I was at this one talk, and the researchers were talking, and there was a guy named Carl Rask he was a consultant. He was a marine biologist, and he helped get the industry off the ground in Wellfleet. And he stood up and he raised his hand. The researchers were talking about the pathogen and how the pathogen could possibly move around. he raised his hand and he said, I just want to point out right now, he said, I want everybody, if you don't take away anything or remember anything else, he said, I want you to remember this. He said, there's two components to disease. One is the presence of the pathogen, and the other is a compromised host. Well, obviously I understood the presence of the pathogen. Again, I don't know what it looks like. It could be airborne, it could be on the desk, but I get it, right? But what is this compromised host? I didn't really understand what that meant. So kind of serendipitously at the same time, I was reading this book that my girlfriend at the time brought me to this talk about. It was a nutritionist. He was holistic and kind of alternative medicine, but his whole preface was that your diet could be making you sick. That if your origins were like European and you ate a whole lot of Mexican food, that could actually make you exposed to the germs that are around you. In the book, it actually said that disease is an ancient word, and it means to be at dis-ease with your environment. So that's your compromised host. If you think about it, in that definition of disease, they don't even talk about the pathogen. They talk about you being at dis-ease with your environment. And then, of course, the pathogen is able to take hold. So in terms of the diet, if you think about like a kid who, 30 kids in a classroom, 2 kids have a cold. Well, shouldn't everybody get the cold? Those kids are sneezing, they're touching the pencil sharpener and the doorknobs, and everybody should get the cold, but it doesn't work that way. And what happens is a kid whose roots are European, he goes out and has Mexican food a couple of nights and it upsets his tummy. He doesn't get a good night's sleep, and the next day he's not as strong as he should be. He gets the cold. So, that completely changed my perspective about disease, that here it is, that it's not really about like I brought these clams in and now there's this crazy anomaly kind of thing that I can't see that's taken over the bay and going to kill all the wild clams, which didn't happen, by the way, thankfully. So the stresses were that those clams, the Bay Farm clams, weren't really adapted to live in the environment that they were in. It was 1995. That was the year I got hit with QPX and really devastated. But it was also the first year that I bought oyster seed, which was a strange choice because there are wild clams in Duxbury, but there were no wild oysters. So when I bought that first batch of little tiny oyster seed, I didn't even know if they would grow. I didn't know if I'd put them in the water in Duxbury Bay and they would all die, or I didn't know what to expect. The cool part was they grew a lot faster than clams. So I would check them like every few days and be like, oh my God, they're growing. In those early days when I had QPX and wondering, should I go get a job? Should I continue on doing what I'm doing? Because at that point, the biggest cost to me was all my friends were, doing what I thought was the responsible thing and getting jobs and building careers. And I was just continuing to go out and dig clams and play a lot of hockey at night and all the things that I wanted to do. So I think that was some really difficult things. And obviously, sometimes things don't work out with employees, and I think that can be some of the hardest things that you have to deal with. And